here at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, and also to all of you who are listening in online. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be sharing this session today on the launch of a book which I know Seeraj has been privileged us with the first launch. There were several launches before this, but this is probably the most important launch for the book because it's taking place here at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. So thank you very much, Seeraj, for allowing us to host this event. I'm very excited about it because, as you can see, it's weighs a whole ton, this book. There have been 30 amazing articles, and I do confess I haven't read all of them. So I'm looking forward as well to the discussion today on the book. What we're going to do today is ask Seeraj Mohamed, who's one of the 3 editors of the book, to give us an overview of some of the context for the book. What did he have in mind, and the other editors when they decided to embark on this project. It's a huge project. I know it took him some time because we didn't see him on several of our walks on Sundays. Yeah. So that will tell us a bit about the context and maybe give us a few of the highlights of some of the thematic issues that are covered in the book. And then we do have one of the authors of one of the chapters of the book, Jessie Burton, who works here at the University of Cape Town for the NED research group. She's a key researcher on energy policy and has done quite a lot of work on the transition from fossil fuel to renewables. So she'll be talking about her chapter, which focuses on that transition, the just transition. Then we're very privileged today to also have with us an honorary professor of the Nelson Mandela School, who is well known in South Africa. And I should say the Honorable Professor Prof Davies, because that's the position he occupies here, but prior to this, he was Minister of Trade and Industry. When I knew him, that's about 30 years ago for the first time, he was a professor at the University of the Western Cape. So once a professor, always a professor. So he's returned to his previous profession. And so we've tasked him really with, a review of the book, although he did say to us that he will give us some comments on and some insights that he's gained from reading most of the chapters in the book. And so that will be a substantive introduction to some of the key themes in the book. And I have no doubt that Rob will do his usual bit of really drawing out some of the key threads of the debates and put on the table some of the key issues that are now the most pressing and urgent for South Africa as we face the next election. And what this book did remind me about is not just my age, but the distance we've covered from the early 90s, when much of the debate about the South Africa's economic policy was taking place. And the formative documents of the time, the ANC, was just returned from exile, had begun to formulate its economic policy. And the first document that was significant, Ready to Govern, is talked about here in this book. But then emerged a number of think tanks, with a vision and hope for the future, setting out some broad elements of an economic policy. One of them was the MERD policy initiative, and followed on by the RDP. I don't know whether anyone remembers that anymore, the Reconstruction and Development Program. Very visionary document that also emerged from the discourse of the time and became, I think, a basis for economic policy thinking. But that all began to disappear very quickly as policymakers began to grapple with the realities of governance and governing in a very hard global political environment. And so the book, many of the chapters in the book start from a number of government policy documents, like GEAR, and then ASPISA, the NDP, and a review of those economic policies. So today what we will have is an overview of some of the chapters that cover different aspects of economic policy, from the core of the economy, the mineral energy complex, to different elements of the South African economy and its trajectory over time. And we will, as we get to the end of the discussion, look at what are the implications of this analysis for the future of this economy and South Africa as we go forward to the next election. So I want to call upon Seeraj Mohamed, who's also a professor.
I don't have a title anymore. I'm just doctor now.
He was a professor at the University of the Western Cape. Prior to that, he was also teaching at the University of Wits, and is currently the head of the budget office, the deputy director of the parliamentary budget office, and is still very involved in thinking and researching the different aspects of the South African economy, providing support to the parliamentarians. So he's done this in a different capacity as a researcher and an academic in his own right. And he's done a really fabulous job in putting together over 30 chapters in this book. Oh, well, over 30 researchers in the book with 18 chapters. So it's done a phenomenal job, Seeraj, in bringing together so many eminent researchers to write these different chapters in the book. So over to you, Seeraj. Can you give us an overview and the context for this book?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Faizel, and for hosting us, and thank you very much to Jesse and Rob, and particularly Rob for taking the time to read and to agree to be discussing, but to the school for hosting us so graciously, and welcoming us. I'm not going to take a long time because I'm really eager to hear Rob's views and possibly be part of the discussion rather than doing a long presentation. I do want to say that, you started off talking about the different organizations like MERG and others back in the day that we were part of when we were younger. But I think this book, when we were pulling it together, we were drawing on the existing minds and people doing really amazing research within South Africa in these different fields. And so I see Sam is online. So Sam from UJ, people from the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at UJ, who did two really good chapters for the book. People from the UCT, and I see Jesse's co-author Lucy is online as well, and welcome to her from far away. Thank you for joining us. And then from Stellenbosch, Mark Swilling, and people from the Center for, what do they call themselves now? It used to be Complexity Studies. I forget what it's now. From Wits, people from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, people from the Institute for Economic Justice. Basane Baloyi was my co-author, who unfortunately being in Johannesburg, couldn't be here, but yeah, we would really, I think she's going to be organizing 1 or 2 events in the new year in Johannesburg. And yes, some very interesting work being done within those centers on understanding how the South African economy is transforming, the structure, etc. And there's also been interesting work, including at the time we started working on this book, the book that came out by Fiona Tugena and Simon Roberts, Andrioni, and I forget the other editors, which I thought really inspired us as well to look at this topic. And the other inspiration was, unfortunately, the approach being taken within government, looking at structural reforms and how to try and grow the economy through structural reforms rather than looking more deeply at the need for structural transformation. And while we were writing, it was during the COVID period where it became ideas that we've been formulating for a long time, but during COVID, it became really clear that when we talk about structural transformation, we need to talk about, on the one side, in industrial and economic transformation, but the other side of that coin is actually looking at the problems, socioeconomic problems, and understand that those are interrelated, not two separate things, and that you solve the problem in South Africa through industrialization. And we know that in countries, in the East Asian countries, for example, that they basically dealt with the social issues and poverty through growth and through rapid growth and industrialization. But alongside that, there was improvement in schooling, better provision of basic services, cheaper and free education and public transport, those kind of things that went alongside and both the productivity and that. There may not have been the social grants and transfers that we require because of the levels of poverty and need in South Africa, but I think it's important for us to recognize structural transformation from both sides of that coin, and that's something that we try to focus on, and also the kind of the intersection of gender, race, and inequality within shaping what we have. And having spoken about sort of the successful industrialization, the chapter that Ben and I worked on as trying to set a context for the book was understanding the impact of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is underpinned by financialization in having shaped what was happening within much of the global economy, and then pointing to how South Africa had been affected by that, but also pointing out how the discourse and the hegemony of neoliberalism within the discourse has eroded the meaning of development, of the developmental state of what industrial policy is, to the point where even people, progressives and people on the left, start almost devaluing or not looking at the actual experiences of the countries that managed to structurally transform and to bring that into the debate in South Africa in a more full way. And so we get stuck in sort of more piecemeal debates about how to improve certain sectors and those things. And I think that kind of work, that kind of research is really important, but we do need to take the bigger picture as well. With that, as we're talking about sort of the bigger picture, we do locate it within the idea that the South African economy developed around a system of accumulation called the Minerals and Energy Complex that developed by Fine and Rust in the 1996 book. And I want to acknowledge Zav's presence in this meeting as well, and welcome and thank you very much, Zav, for coming. And that we still draw on your work very much, as you can see. And in our chapter, we talked about how that MEC has become financialized. And so we use the term, the MEFC, which I think Rob will make a few comments about. He's not totally happy with that formulation, but I think it's what we are saying is that we need to understand how the South African economy evolved through a specific, or we put that specific lens on how we see the evolution of the South African economy, and a lot of what gets left out of the discussion today, where we focus on sort of what's, the problems of Eskom, the transit and the roads, corruption, state capture, is that we actually stop talking about capital. We stop talking about big business, the level of concentration in the economy. And the chapters by Sam Ashman and by Tebogo Mosiyo and Thando Vilakazi, we're looking at so Sam's chapter specifically on the MEC, and if it's still in a relevant concept. It's called Limits and Prospects in the Development of South African Capitalism Beyond the MEC. And the chapter by Thando and Tebogo is sort of looking at key trends amongst the top 100 firms on the JSE. And that was really important, I think, for us to have right in the beginning of the book to set that framework for how we understand the structure of the economy, the role being played by the largest corporations. And how, even though they've been offshore listings of some of the largest, their subsidiaries still have the benefits of having the permits, the institutional structures, the influence to keep dominating markets. And that's been shown by the Competition Commission and others, besides the people at CRED, who've done excellent work, I think, on this. Then there's a chapter on the macroeconomic policy and what the impact of having had a neoliberal, the negative impact of having had a neoliberal macro policy that's covered, I think, over a long period and really well in detail by Asghar. Plus, he refers to sort of his model and the outcomes of showing what alternative types of macro policies outcomes could have been. The chapters, I'm not going to talk too much about the energy just transition. Jesse will talk about that. But to say, in terms of thinking about the MEC and how it's changed, and also then where we need to go and the changes that need to come when we still very much have the legacy of the MEC, I think that's a really important part of that. And the chapters on we pulled together the chapter on manufacturing and retailing into one chapter, and we thought it's time to move beyond just thinking about manufacturing in itself. But there are two parts to that chapter, one on each, by Brina Dasnaya and Jason Bell, both again at CRED, that I think talk very much very well through the different value chains in both manufacturing and in grocery retail, that I think is very much worth looking at. I feel like I'm taking too long, and I feel like I'm starting to tell you about each chapter. So I think I'm going to slow down there, except to mention the chapter by Basani Baloyi, Miriam De Paula, and Andrew McCandler, which is looking at who bears the cost, the invisible work of social reproduction that brings, I think, what I was saying earlier, sort of the other side of the coin of structural transformation. The fact that when the state doesn't provide enough support, and we have structural unemployment, poverty, and inequality, the weight of that poverty and inequality and unemployment falls onto particularly women and their need to support the households and household reproduction. And household reproduction is basically what keeps the rest of the economy ticking over. So there's this kind of subsidization through the suffering of household members, community members, and particularly women who play that role in reproducing households, but also making sure that communities function and as much as they can within these levels of poverty. So I think those are sort of some of the broader themes and the approach that was taken in thinking about the kind of book we wanted to put out, particularly having gone through the struggles of COVID and the lockdowns and the increasing unemployment and poverty during that period, and responding, I think, to government's narrow approach, which is very much focused on the supply side, a very mainstream view of structural reform to try and solve the problems when in fact, my view is that all what the structural reforms will do is exacerbate the existing inequalities and the role that the big businesses play within their concentration and ability to extract wealth rather than reinvest and help build the economy. And that the need to look at building resilience in households, improving the education levels, the productivity of households, and their providing them with what they need, housing, education, and those services should very much, again, be part of a demand-side approach to looking at slowly transforming the South African economy and then building up to a broader economic transformation from that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Seeraj, for giving us that overview. I'll pass on to Jessie.
Oh, do you want me to go now? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Seeraj. And thanks, everybody, and thank you, of course, to Lucy, who is my co-author on this chapter. I think that leads in very well to the chapter we did, which was really on just transition and energy, and sort of why energy, besides that it's the minerals energy complex, which everyone seems to forget. I think that legacy that you mentioned, Seeraj, is very important. So we have now a situation where South Africa is the most coal-dependent country in the world. And the legacy of that MEC is a huge, very high levels of emissions. We're one of the largest per capita emitters in the world. That coal dependency, 800 abandoned mines in a place like Mpumalanga, very uncompetitive inputs into some of our critical industrial sectors. But energy also accounts for 86% of our emissions, 86% of coal in the electricity system, and 86% of emissions are coming from coal. So it's this major area of transformation in the coming years, and of course a major site of contestation. And climate change will really start to alter fundamentally the boundary conditions of this world that we find ourselves in which we have to undertake structural transformation. It sets what can be and what can't be competitive going into the future. And we run very much that risk. We've ground all the rent out of Eskom that we could possibly grind through, kind of non-cost reflective electricity, through very expensive coal contracts, through kind of the petty corruption that has now taken root everywhere on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have other very large corporates who are very coal dependent, who aren't able to shift themselves onto this new pathway. And then you see other parts of business who got some of that rent out of Eskom and elsewhere over very many years, abandoning these failing systems very quickly, putting in their own renewable energy, diversifying out of coal very quickly and fragmenting the structure that seemed to work for very many years. Which leaves you now in this interesting position where you have some local coal companies who are actually also developing wind projects, for example, in the coal region, but other mining companies who've just pulled out of coal completely. And the response to this, of course, has been this emerging discourse and discussion, which is now hugely prevalent in the climate change and energy policy communities around just transition. So what is this new political project? And structural transformation is kind of seen as one of those pillars. Of course, industrial policy being critical, but building these new value chains, both in coal regions, which are sort of a microcosm of the whole MEC. I mean, Mpumalanga is the heart of it. If there were a spatial core of the minerals energy complex, it would be in Mpumalanga. But also going much further beyond that. So it's automotives, it's iron and steel. Can you do green iron ore exports? And so all of these discussions around structural transformation are becoming really, really critical in the just transition and in the energy transformation conversations. But I see a lot of the risks that you're talking about, that we move from one large monopoly to a series of oligopolies, for example, as we have in other sectors. But that's our chapter, and I'll hand to Rob, and I'm sure he's going to come back with lots on all of them.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for those insights in your paper. So you bring us really to the current conjuncture as we're in the development of the economy, because you really bring us to face squarely the issue of the transition that we have to now accelerate, which is that to decarbonize the economy, and particularly in the energy sector. And so it's a very interesting, fascinating book for me, and I aim to read all the chapters because it really is a window into the last 30 years and the trajectory of the South African economy during that time. And I like a lot of the chapters which really engage with the different ideas, the theories, the paradigms, the narratives that we started with. And that's why I started by talking about the ready to govern and something called the RDP, which I'm sure most of us have forgotten. But there were some paradigms there, some ideas, and then there were the changing paradigms, and something quite extraordinary, actually. The consistency of the narrative on macroeconomic policy from the beginning to the end, whereas, you know, we've gone through a 30-year period of very different ideas on macroeconomic policy. If you think of the Washington consensus, the post-Washington consensus, the recession and the changes in the World Bank and IMF's views about a number of key issues on macroeconomic policy, and now the discussions going on in the IMF, because they have to all learn about industrial policy, because right there in Washington, that's the biggest new paradigm that has emerged, industrial policy. So, and here in South Africa, you know, what the book does tell us is that there's this contradiction. Last week, we had Professor Kieran Lee from Seoul National University, who was here with us. And he gave us a picture of the data over the last 30 years on the performance of South Africa relative to not just the late industrializers, of which we are one, but the late industrializers, the guys who came after us and overtook us, one of which was South Korea. But hey, China, and where was it 30 years ago? And he shows us the data, and we see in that trajectory the distance that those countries have traveled at the same time as South Africa, and the huge gap that speaks to the fundamental questions in South Africa: jobs, poverty, and inequality, and how the lack of transformation of the economy has meant that we've really not made much progress. In fact, on many of these indicators we have received. So the question really that for this review and engagement with the book is why? Why has South Africa not performed as well as some of the other competitor countries that Kieran Lee talked about? And these are the sort of late industrializers. How is it that they were able to make huge gains in transformation and also on some of the key social indicators? And how does the book and some of the chapters in it address these questions? So I'm hoping that up for Davies to give us his take.
Okay, thanks, Faizel, and thanks to the editor and the author of one of the chapters for their inputs. Let me start by saying that I think this is a very good book. I think it's a very important book. It's got a lot of information in it as well as analysis, and I would recommend it to people on that score. Analyses of, I think I was fascinated by a number of the tables on the bigger companies in South Africa and how they've changed over the years. I might just refer to that. But I think it's got a main theme. It's about the structural changes of the South African economy. And it's looking at it in two ways. It's looking about the structural change that has already happened. And then it's looking about the structural transformation that we need. And I just want to refer to it. I'm going to read it from the introductory chapter. And they're quoting from a definition by, is his name Antonio Andrioni. He says that by structural transformation, we refer to changes in the structure of the economy towards activities with the scope for sustained high growth in productivity, in particular through cumulative improvements. This has a strong sectoral dimension and specifically recognizes the central importance of industrialization to a path of sustained economic growth and catching up. So that's what the book is saying in one way or another in many of the chapters. That's what we need, but we've had something that's quite different to that. And I think that's the central kind of overriding theme, as I see it, that kind of guides all of the chapters in this book. They're either addressing where we've come from or where we need to go. I do want to say, because the term was mentioned in at least two places. One was in the introduction, and the other one was mentioned in the chapter which is dealing with the economic reconstruction and recovery program after COVID, the chapter by Yakub Abba-Omar, which is structural reform. Now, I think it's important that we understand that these are very different concepts. Even though there was a sort of like a homegrown massaging of the concept of structural reform derives from the World Bank, from the OECD, and is essentially about liberalizing sectors where there are public utilities with a view to privatizing those sectors. And I think that's the path we're on. Sometimes these concepts are mixed up. They sound the same. Structural transformation, structural reform, they're not the same. I think these are two very different things. I think we need to understand that actual practice is more in the direction of structural reform at the moment. Now, when we talk about the structural changes up to now, many of the chapters, the chapter that is the one with Seeraj and I'm just an old man, Ben Fine. Forgetting Ben Fine, I cannot forget Ben Fine. But the chapter by Seeraj and Ben Fine, and then Samantha Ashman later on as well, they're referring to the fact that the minerals energy complex that was in the Fine and Rustengi analysis back in the 1990s was saying that our economy was rooted in the structure of the minerals energy complex, that what industrialization we had was closely linked to that, hadn't broken out of that stranglehold. That was the analysis they gave. Now they want to add a dimension because they say as a result of the pursuit of neoliberal policy, we've had financialization. And so they introduced this concept of we're now in the minerals energy financial complex. Now, as Seeraj was saying, I want to say to Seeraj as well, I think that they should actually change the initials. It's the financialized mineral energy complex. We haven't broken out of the minerals energy complex, but the whole economy has become financialized, and that is the biggest structural change that has taken place in South Africa over the last 30 years. The chapter that Seeraj and Ben Fine do is interesting. It shows us how neoliberalism is developing, how financialization becomes an issue. But what it doesn't do, and it's a real pity because there's sitting next to me is the person in South Africa who's probably best equipped to do this, is to present a substantial analysis of the financialization of the South African economy. Let me throw in a couple of statistics I gleaned from elsewhere that I think show it, and this is not even the whole thing. So in 1994, the share of financial services in the GDP was 6%. It's now about 25%, okay? Then I came across a figure that was in a presentation by Duma Kupuli, that there are 21 trillion rands worth of financial assets in South Africa. It's about 3 times the GDP of South Africa. Now, 7.2 trillion of that is in the hands of banks, and 13.8 trillion is in the hands of non-bank financial institutions. This is what we've got. We've got what's called the wealth management industry that has grown up in South Africa. Now, what is it doing? It's not investing in the productive sector. It's not investing in manufacturing or industrialization. It's not investing in agriculture or mining, really. It's investing in other financialized products. A lot of it is offshore. There was an article recently that was pointing out that when the exchange control regulations were changed to allow 10 million rand to go offshore, a huge amount went offshore. This is what we've got. And I think that I was fascinated by some of the tables, because back in the 19th century, when I used to do research in Maputo and look at the Financial Mail top companies, there's a completely different order of top companies now. We've got all the banks are in the top 40 or in the top 100, and also a number of other financial corporations. Seeraj will tell us, because I know he's done other presentations. It's not only in the financial sector that non-financial firms are involved in financialized practices. That's what we've got in the South African economy. Now, I think that the thing is deindustrialization, which is what we have. We have premature deindustrialization in South Africa. I would want to say, because I was in government, and there was a recent paper that was Harju Changage, and he said, well, he's using your figures. He said, before, in the 1960s, South Africa was literally the most industrialized country outside of the core of the developed world. Now we are nothing in terms of our manufacturing value added per capita. We're nothing any longer. We've been overtaken by not only Korea and China, but many others. We don't even feature any longer in the tables. He says that industrial policy has sort of tried to move in the right direction since 2007. But it's not at scale, it doesn't have the centrality, and it comes up against the reality of this financialized economy. And I think that's the issue. And so I really, really enjoyed the quote that starts the paper by Asghar Abdulzadeh. Asghar, I just call it because I can't really say his second name properly. But it's from Keynes. And Keynes says, the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. That's where we are. That's where we are in South Africa. And, he goes through in his chapter. And this is not the first time that Asghar has given this kind of analysis. He's given it many, many times. It's well known. He looks at what happens if we carry on the trajectory we're on now. What happens to poverty, inequality, unemployment? They don't get any better. We sit around in 5-10 years' time, we're in the same boat. We've actually got unemployment now, which is higher than it was before COVID. And along with that is poverty and inequality. That's what happens. We carry on with the same set of policies, the same old ideas. That's where we are. Then he raises provocatively, in his way to present an alternative set of scenarios. He says, what if the government and public corporations systematically increase their investments in economic infrastructure by 10% annually? What if the Reserve Bank, instead of just following a narrow inflation targeting mandate, it actually followed a mandate of targeting 6% growth as well as price stability? What if government spending were increased by 10.5% to provide funding to expand the delivery of individual and collective social services? And he goes on with a whole lot of what-ifs like that, which I think are the essence of an alternative strategy that we should be following to deliver, some immediate improvements in the indicators that are really, really problematic, and also to begin the process of structural transformation. The question I want to raise is, why are we not doing this? Why are we not doing this? Is it because somebody hasn't read this piece of work, or somebody doesn't understand it? The answer is not that. The answer is because of the power and influence of financialized capital. That's what it is. They are absolutely dominant. Look who is running Business Unity South Africa, business leadership, and all that. It's the financial institutions. Because the pursuit of the ratios, the macroeconomic ratios, above all else, whatever the circumstances, is not an irrational thing from their point of view. It's part of being integrated into the Western globalized financial system. That's what it's about. That's where they make their money, from that engagement. And they are the ones that call the shots. And they've got a very, very close interaction and a revolving door with National Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And that is the locus of power in economic decision-making, macroeconomic policy. So I want to suggest that, there was Adam Tooze, who's quite a well-known heterodox economist. He visited Wits a little while ago. And I saw this engagement that he had with the governor of the Reserve Bank. And he said to him, he said, is it not that the pursuit of stability in the financial system is to the disadvantage of the rest of the economy? And I think that's the essence of the question. That's the essence of the issue. So I want to say that as long as we're stuck in this trap, as long as financialized capital continues to call the shots, it's not going to it's going to be a very powerful force that's going to constrain our macro policy and is going to lead us into the scenario that Asgar is telling us is going to continue to lead us to low growth, economic stagnation, and high inequality. I also wanted to say that I enjoyed the chapter by Basani, Baloy, and others. I think it was making a very, very important point. They quote from somewhere from Marx, an old gentleman with a long beard in the 19th century. And he said that the sphere of production is simultaneously a sphere of social reproduction. And I think that's the issue. So what does it mean? It means that if we are in stagnation, then the sphere of social reproduction is bearing the cost and the burdens of a society which has got some of the highest rates of unemployment, poverty, and inequality in the world. And that this is the basis of feminized poverty. I think that's the point. I read somewhere that the families are below the food poverty line. Something like 2/3 of those are female-headed. I think that's the sort of reality that we've got in South Africa. Is that link is there, and so I think the fundamental issue is the one about it's not the new ideas that are the problem. It's breaking out of the old ideas. And why don't we break out of the old ideas? I think that's the issue that we need to pursue. And so I would want to encourage that we need to see many more analyses of that sort. What is the extent of financialization? Because I don't think it's an accident that financialization and deindustrialization, it's not an accident. They're not unlinked processes. They are linked processes. They're very much linked processes. And the fact of the matter is I remember, Nimrod, if he was here, would confirm this, that we found out when we started industrial policy in 2009 and the IPAPs and everything, we looked at where do the banks invest? The part that goes to support any kind of productive activity is going down. The part that's growing is consumption. It's consumption-related services that are then financialized. That's where the profits are made in the financial sector in South Africa. So we're not having any investment. That raises another point that I think Mark Swilling and them, they're dealing with the rebuilding of the state-owned enterprises. There are lots of things they're saying about that. I think the point, as I understood their central argument, is that you can't expect that just outsource them to profit-seeking institution and all will be sorted out. You've actually got to engage a hard graft of rebuilding those state-owned enterprises. But one of the things they do focus on is development finance institutions. And I think these are critical. I want to mention one thing, because Mark Swilling was the chair of the DBSA. But I just want to mention something that was on the table and went off the table. Why did I, as then government at the time, Minister of Trade and Industry, agree quite readily to hand over the IDC to the Minister of Economic Development? Because at the time, the idea was that we were going to build something like the BNDES of Brazil, which was a the development finance institution, both for industrial development and for infrastructure. And that we wanted to merge the two, create an institution like that. And then the other thing about this is that, if you're going to, I think the IDC has never had any public money since Strydom was the Prime Minister of South Africa. It's had to run off its balance sheet. The BNDES there's a levy on top of unemployment insurance for employment creation, goes into that, and expands the fund. That's what we need, something like that in South Africa, because that's the only way that you're going to fund industrial development. So we sit at the moment, and I think the reality is we start looking at the budget now, and Seeraj in his other hat will know this. We're seeing there's austerity. Everything is being cut. Everything is going to be less bang for buck. And we're going into this vicious cycle. You know, you prioritize the achievement of the financial ratios. You're not there yet. So you achieve them by cutting. You then, the effect of cutting in a depressed economy is to depress it further. Then you reduce taxes. Then you have to cut again because your ratios are not on track. So I think that's the conundrum that we're in. As I said, I thought that the tables were fascinating. The tables of who's who in the zoo, in the GASE top 40, in the top 100 companies, all of that. I think those bear a lot of say because they tell us that there's a different story. That financial institutions are up there. I wanted to just make a few points about the chapter that Jesse was involved in. So I think that you make the point that the one part of the NEC, the energy part of it, is going and there are relentless pressures to decarbonization. Well, of course, that is the case. That is the case. I think your chapter would have benefited a lot if you had looked at not just the various calls for a just transition, but actually what is now being regarded as the just transition. So we've got this JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership thing, where South Africa is the front runner and the pilot study. Now it's extended to a number of other countries as well. What is that thing? That thing is loans denominated in foreign currency. Less than 5% of it is grants. All of it is for mitigation. None of it is for adaptation. None of it is to infrastructure, any of our infrastructure, climate-proof, any of our infrastructure or anything like that. All of it is for that. And it's also in programs that are going to be sort of co-determined by those who are providing the loans. Eventually, we have to pay it back. Now, the developed world said they were going to transfer $100 billion a year. They haven't transferred $8 billion to us. They've transferred 4% of $8 billion. And maybe you can say the discount on the interest rate, but not the rest is on our books. We have to pay it back. And we have to take the foreign exchange risk of it as well. The second thing I want to say is that I think that it's worth reflecting on. I think we've fallen for a trap here that we have made the public utility is the sector that's linked to coal, and the rising sector is the profit-making institutions, is the private sector. That's a problem that we made. Instead of having a public utility also starting to invest in renewable energy, we've got this is the private sector. Now, when I was in politics and I used to go around and do door-to-door in rural areas, I think that the one thing that made the biggest difference to people in a house was electrification. Because when they got electricity, they got television, they had access to news and entertainment, and they also get a fridge, they can store food. More important than the road outside. You know, obviously the road there is better as well. Now, are these private sector profit-seeking institutions going to be providing a rollout of energy to low-income people? Or are they going to service the upper-income market? Experience of everywhere else tells us they'll do the second. So I think that's the issue there. And so I would suggest that you know we've been discussing in the school a whole lot of things, because the third element is, are we going to industrialize off this transition or not? Are we going to be importing somebody else's wind towers and whatever? Or are we going to insist that that anybody who puts up wind towers they're going to be manufactured in South Africa. And then we've got an area where I think is a big advantage for us, and that is the green hydrogen. But you know what the Europeans want from green hydrogen? They want us to produce the fuel. We must use sunlight to electrolyze water. There's a bit of a problem there because where the sunlight is, we don't have much water. And I asked somebody once in something naively, I said, can we electrolyze seawater? He said, no, fresh water only. So they want us to produce the fuel and then freeze it and send it off. That just replaces natural gas. What we really need to do is to be manufacturing the fuel cells, and then the things that use the fuel cells, underground mining vehicles, public transport vehicles, small power stations, and so on. So I think those are some of the issues in that is a very important transition. Let me say one other thing that I don't think has been taken account of, and I don't blame you because it's not really taken account of anywhere, because it's not a dominant capital that's based in South Africa, but it's one that's dominating us, and that is tech, big tech. It's Johannes Varoufakis would want to say that the European Union is also not a player in this space, and this is the space where we are at. We are providing tons and tons of data to foreign companies. These companies are shaping our economic futures, and so not only is it South African financialized capital, but it's also tech capital, which is outside. Let me just make a couple of other points about some of the other papers. I thought that the Joel Netshitenzhi, he's talking about two things. He's talking about special economic zones and things like that. He's trying to talk about, he's going back to Thabo Mbeki's idea about the two economies, the first and the second economy. He's talking about the second economy. But he's also making a point about that we need to have programs to address the informal economy. I just want to say I think he's absolutely right about that. And I want to just give an example, and I think is going to be critical to get that off the ground. Back in 2013, 2014, when small business was still under the DTI, we launched something called the National Informal Business Upliftment Strategy. And the conceptual change that was important there was that instead of demanding, this is every other program, you have to be tax compliant, you have to get a certificate of SARS or something if you want to get this. We said, well, we want you to get there eventually, but we're not going to insist on that as a condition to support you now. We'll start supporting you now. And I think that was a sort of a thing that needs to happen. But I think that particular program has kind of gone down the great big black hole, which doesn't exist any longer. But I just wanted to make that point about that. I'll make one final point, because and I could make points about almost every chapter, but I want to make just one final one. That's the chapter by Alan Hirsch, which is on regional integration. So he's dealing mostly with SADC and SACU, in passing only with the African Continental Free Trade Area. And he makes a point when he concludes, he says, well, there are all these arrangements and we're part of all these arrangements. But then he wants to argue that South Africa is protectionist towards the rest of the continent. Now, I want to just say that I don't agree with that exactly. I think that where South Africa tends to be protectionist, or is accused of being protectionist, it's usually when there are possibilities that it's not going to be a product that actually really originates in another country. It's going to be a screwdriver industry or low level of value addition. Those are the issues I think that South Africa tends to take a stand on, that could be called in that way. Where I think there's a bigger point is that South Africa tends to approach the region in a mercantilist way. We tend to look at the rest of the region, how can we export to them, instead of thinking about how we can, with the rest of the region and the continent, build value chains. That's the kind of work that we've been trying to do in the Advisory Council and elsewhere in the school. So I thought, let me just stop there. I made a few points, but let me just finish where I started and saying I think that this is a very good book. and I will recommend it to anybody who wants to listen to me, and say congratulations for a piece of work well done. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Well, that was a tour de force. I think you covered, almost all the issues that the Kentuckians engage with, and you also added really an agenda for research going forward for the school and for policymakers, and certainly for those concerned about the development of this country. I just want to make 2 points, maybe that the book really doesn't cover, because it's really about South Africa. And as I spent too much time in Geneva, what I did observe was around 2008, 2009, the collapse of the so-called WTO Doha round. So what was interesting about that was the main reason for the collapse were 2 things. One was Wall Street, and the other was Silicon Valley, because the political economy forces in the United States that were rising, and there was some declining. So the rising ones were the financial services sector, and of course, big tech. And those sectors really, since then, have dominated the debate and the discourse in the WTO on the rules or the lack of rules, because that is one of the consequences of the collapse of the Doha round. But on the other side was the deindustrialization in the United States. It was very real. We did see it in bed when we saw the rise of Trump, and we saw that the political consequences of that was the rise of populism in the United States, which mirror to a large extent some of the developments in the South African context. So just to put the sort of global context to what was happening in South Africa was quite unique. It did mirror to a large extent global trends. So what's also happening is that these narratives and ideas, which emerged in the United States, the so-called Washington consensus, it so happens these 2 big, think tanks on economic policy are in Washington. So the Washington consensus was the ideas that were generated there and had a big influence in South Africa in the 1990s. And of course, the policymakers here couldn't escape that. But what's happening there now is that this decline, the deindustrialization, has had the impact of protectionism and a shift in economic policy to reindustrialize. And what's also propelling that is the point that Jessie in her paper started raising, which is the new global competition, the geoeconomics, which comes from climate change, propelled and stimulated by climate change, the need to transition to decarbonize. So what it is doing is that it's really bringing heterodox policies back in a big way. So Kieran Lee was telling us last week that he's been up to the IMF talking to them and teaching them about industrial policy because they don't know. And the US has changed its policy. It's now the biggest promoter of industrial policy on earth. And when the US moves, everything changes. So you'll see a lot of that in different forms, in different policies around the world. So what it raises for us really is this an opportunity? Is it an opportunity for South Africa to rethink its economic policy, not just macroeconomic policy, because macroeconomic policy clearly, it needs to be rethought, but economic policy as a whole, how we think about issues related to industrial policy, or infrastructure development. There's a huge amount of resources going into infrastructure in the United States. But of course, we know in the East, and China's had these policy banks and development finance institutions that promoted and Brazil, BNDES you mentioned, was really good at using development finance to develop its both infrastructure and industrialization. So these are some of the things that should be on the agenda of the policymakers in South Africa as we think about how we go forward from the really appalling data that we've seen here on the social indicators for South Africa. So
I have to say something
yes.
on that. I mean, it's linked to the transition to the low carbon economy. You know, the United States has got this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's got some chapters on green transition. And the amount that's envisaged there over several years is nearly the GDP of South Africa, which they provide. And they also do things like they, you know, I think in actually violation of at least the spirit, but probably also directly the letter of some of the rules. They're offering in the private sector, if you buy a battery that's manufactured in the US, you get a $15,000 tax credit. And then when the EU complained, they said, well, okay, you can include the EU as well. Never happened anywhere else. Now, I think that the issue is that they're doing it for themselves. They're not telling the rest of us that this is the new policy. They're telling the rest of us to carry on doing what we're doing now because they want to flog us their products. They don't want us to industrialize. So I think it's a question of learning to do as they do, not as they say. That's the issue that we need to learn out of that. But I mean, definitely, there's a major shift. But it's all driven as well by the competition with China because China's ahead in this sphere. Now they have to play catch up in these green technologies. Those are the issues that we've got there. But I just wanted to add those points here because I think they're quite important. And it definitely is the case that you know, new practices are emerging. But again, are we going to be able to drive a narrative which is going to overcome the old ideas, which are still very strongly entrenched in important forces in South Africa? I think that's going to be the key question. If we don't, we're on a track to continued poverty, inequality, and unemployment.
Great. Okay, so a good start to a conversation, and I hope it does become a conversation. I'm looking at a lot of people online. Some of you have also published, and I'm sure I have many things to say, both about the book and also about some of the points that were raised by Seeraj, Jesse, and Rob in his presentation and engagement with the book. And I'd like to see a sort of an intergenerational dialogue here, because clearly we made a lot of mistakes, some of us with gray hair. And let's listen to the next generation, because really you have the opportunity to fix, undo, fix some of these things and learn from our mistakes. So anybody who wants to jump in and ask the question or just make comments or say you don't agree with anything that anyone has said, including myself. Yes, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Michelle. I also used to be in government at one stage and in the NGO, and now doing this academic fraternity. But so I'm working on this German-funded Just Transition project that's situated with Jessica and Harrow Works, the energy research systems group. Yeah, so part of me feels this conversation is deja vu, and if you were in government, you were having this conversation about the WTO, and I'm wondering why we're still having this conversation when clearly there's an understanding of where the bottlenecks are in this country, and Treasury's role. And yeah, so my research in the PhD was looking at the renewable energy procurement program and its implementation in a community, the Sisikana Community Wind Farm that partnered with Exara, Synergy, the cleaner energy company. So when Rob said all these profit-making energy projects, bring energy and jobs, no, it's not happening. And even though this community ticks all the policy boxes, partnering on reclaimed land, lacking economic empowerment, community partnership, the well-being of this community has not changed. And the soil, because the wind turbines on the soil of big dairy farms that's destroyed. So part of me is also feel uncomfortable that this conversation is as if the earth is inert, dead for constant extraction, whether the Chinese are doing it and we hope to catch up. So I'm wondering why we're still in development catch-up politics, and where is the space for something different? And this particular community, when they were living there in 1977, the Sitikama and Pengu, had land, was cultivating their own food, was probably quite self-sufficient, and wasn't working the capitalist kind of exchange. It was non-capitalist values and had to be moved off the sky. And so why aren't we also remembering ways outside of the Western industrial model? So yes, I feel there's a bit of sadness.
Right, okay, thank you so much. So that's bringing in another dimension to the debate. And as we go through the just transition, yeah, that's really a relevant question about, different ways of living and different ways of producing and growing. What are the options, other options on the table? Anyone else wants to join in? Yes.
I just had a comment. I think for me.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Mike. So I had a comment in regards to. I've listened to the debates centered around the book, but I didn't hear anybody touch on the education curriculum that's being served in schools, because I think this plays a big role in terms of the sectors which then grow afterwards, like in terms of the industry that young graduates then get into, the career advice that they get. Our education curriculums in Africa, if you notice, are very centered on I want to be a doctor, I want to be an accountant. These are not innovative fields. Like you go to other countries, you go to Japan, you go to South Korea, these guys want to manufacture, they want to be in tech, they want to be in different industries. Our education curriculum, especially in Africa, is sort of outdated, and we're playing catch up in terms of the things we're teaching are the same things we're taught in colonial systems. How then do we adjust our education curriculum to fit these transitions you're talking about, this technology? You go to school, people are teaching IT, but they don't have computers in the room, but they're teaching IT. You ask yourself, how are we going to catch up to creating apps when students still understand IT from 20 years ago, a computer, a mouse? These are the questions which are being asked on exam papers. So that was my
great.
No,
that's a very good point and very useful. I think a commentary on not just school education, but also postgraduate graduate education at tertiary level. We were in Rwanda a few weeks ago, and we talked to people at the African Leadership University. I must say, I was very, very impressed with the paradigm shift in their thinking about, introducing entrepreneurship, innovation, and technology into both, school and just post-school level education. Not a complete answer, but certainly a huge departure from the traditional way of thinking about the curriculum. So yes, there are opportunities for us to rethink the curriculum. So I see Sam Ashman on the screen. Please, you can unmute yourself and please go ahead, and if you want to say something, just introduce yourself and make your point.
Hi everyone. Well, greetings from my kitchen, so I won't put the video on. 2 points. One on Rob, I agree. So I think I'll just leave that there, keep that brief. I actually have a question for Jessie, which is, I mean, I thought your chapter with Lucy was really good, and I'm interested in your reading, your take on kind of where the MEC, the mining core, is going, because from what I'm seeing, which is very much what you're saying in the chapter, is you see there's an attempt by really important players like Anglo and Sibanye to decarbonize their own operations, like introducing green hydrogen and so forth, but then also to position themselves as the supplier of green minerals, so that they secure their long-term demand, and they put themselves at the center of the new scramble for the green, the minerals necessary for the transition. And that seems to, A, do you agree this is where it's going? And B, obviously, there are great limitations to what this means in terms of changing the structure of the economy, changing employment levels, the big limitations of green capitalism, I guess. Is that what you're seeing too?
Great. So I'll ask the speakers to come back and respond to all the questions, and or anyone who wish to. But let's have more voices coming in. Feel free to also make comments, because let's make this a a kind of discussion, more like a panel discussion rather than a question and answer. Because to be fair to the presenters, yeah, we only have 2 people who've written chapters in the book. Read all the chapters, so yes, if you want to, yes, please introduce yourself. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Hi.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I mean, we've heard the logic behind the pursuance of austerity as usually they get. So, National Treasury tells us we have to have that on spending force. We are not generating revenue. There's not much growth happening in the economy. Therefore, our debt is spiraling out of control. We need to then sustain our debt at a particular level. And that's primarily the main logic that is being we've seen that consistently happening from 2012, 2011, consistently up now. My main issue is, I mean, maybe I can take advantage of that from my ministers there. We had some extensive discussion around that 2012. What really happens at that point, or how do we get out of that point where we are told that the only way out of this debt problem is to cut back on expenditure? How then do we mitigate also the effects of expiring debt as well? At what level are we at least expecting to maintain our debt levels to be able to ensure this? The other part is related to the Reserve Bank, the role that the Reserve Bank should play, or rather, the developmental role that it perhaps should be played. I know there's some scholars like Stephen Carrington who spoken about how the confusion that we have mostly is that governments confuse the budget of its budget to another household, which is not the case. In fact, when you have monitors of the calamity at the country, you cannot have of money. Now, we've been told that on a fiscal trip, the government has no money, so you have to cut that. So, what then becomes the role that is not in financing development, firstly, and also generally in its role in structural transformation and transformation?
Great, those are good questions. So I'm sure Seeraj will have a lot to say about it, but also Prof, because he was part of some of those debates and how those debates get resolved in government. Anybody else want to jump in? Feel free to also just comment, on any of the chapters that you may have read or the discussion so far on some of the themes that have emerged from the book. Okay, so maybe we can have a first round of responses, and then let's see if there's provoke any more questions. Would like to go first.
Why don't you go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Rob and everyone. I'll respond to some of the particular comments. So, I mean, very simply, the JP wasn't public when we wrote the chapter, so we couldn't put any of the numbers in there. And of course, climate injustice and kind of developed country intransigence in a multilateral regime is a well-known problem. But I think we shouldn't pretend that, and we can't be naive that this isn't a geopolitical diplomatic deal, right? And we knew what we were getting ourselves into. And I think this is a kind of response to several of your questions, which it seems underlying all of it that we're avoiding the real kind of problem here, which is that there's a political and institutional issue. We've discussed interest and capital, but other countries are subject to those same pressures of capital. We've discussed ideas. We as a country, as government, keep making decisions that are wrong. When we say we want to address poverty or inequality or industrialization, we undo work that we ourselves have done. We cancel the local content rules in our renewables procurement. We cancel community ownership. Whatever the challenges of that, it's now gone. So all of those developmental benefits are scrapped from the program. We undermine the IDC's investments in local manufacturing and factories, and there's no discussion about it. There's been nothing, no debate, no political engagement. I don't know who made that decision. They produced a new procurement document and it's done. And it's this, I mean, there's a kind of disdain with which industrial policy is treated by government over many years. No, sorry, ex-minister. Maybe you can want to talk about that. Yeah. Like, where does that pressure come from? Why can't we fund the IDC, which depended on a whole lot of MEC sectors for its profitability, to do something new?
Yeah.
Why don't we have a RESCOM, a renewable RESCOM, who's doing something new? Because Eskom's cost of capital is lower than private IPPs. If you want to deploy huge amounts of renewables as we need to, they would be perfectly positioned to do it. Yeah. But now they can't do it. We've eroded them. So I suppose it's how do you dig yourself out of that hole?
Right. Okay, great. No, I think those are great political economy questions about how this country like ours, democratic, supposedly developmental, often get the policy wrong, but sometimes get the policy right, but then we implement it wrongly. Or don't implement it. So what intervenes?
We make the choices, right? Yeah. The JP we decided which sectors we wanted to be in. The government did, whoever was in the room. They picked those sectors. Right. Why isn't adaptation in? Yeah. That's a question for the government.
Yeah. Good question. So I was like,
yeah. Perhaps I should start, before I forget, start at the question of debt. And I mean, it's interesting that you raise Stephanie Carlton. So you are familiar with sort of the MMT perspective. And I mean, I don't think we need to go that far to say government can spend as much as it can. I think part of what we're trying to get across within the book is that in order to transform and then grow based on dealing with sort of building resilience in households, but also in industrial transformation as economy, it requires that investment by the government. And I think, I mean, I should have actually written a chapter on fiscal policy for the book as well, in addition to what Asghar put forward. But I think Asghar's scenarios say this really well, right? Is that when you start actually promoting productivity and growth, and you also create the conditions within households, the poorest households, where they have income to spend back into the economy, that expenditure by government is actually an investment into the economy and is spent into the economy, which is very much in line with the kind of functional finance view that Carlton and the MMT people are making. It's not that government there's government expenditure, and then that money disappears, and that's just a burden to the economy and taxpayers. That money actually goes and creates growth within the economy. And there may be a debate over what the fiscal multiplier is and different views on that. But for me, I think the main thing is that when you live in a country with structural unemployment and inequality, where we're not only the most unequal in the world, but we're an outlier. I think many of us who sort of in the ivory towers and in the middle class and working in government don't actually have a sense of that gap in South Africa. You know, the bottom 50%, according to the World Inequality Lab's numbers, have a negative 2% wealth because they have debt. The top 1% have more about, I think it's over 60%. And the top 10% have about 85%. Actually, I don't think the top 1% is 60%, maybe it's 35 or 40%. I shouldn't get my numbers mixed up. But so the thinking about debt as narrowly as we currently are with our austerity policies is actually negative for growth. And so I'm sorry to go on so long because I work on this kind of stuff in my real job. I write this book cycles on the side. You know, the theoretical framework of fiscal consolidation comes from the work of I mustn't blank on names. But it's based on this notion of contractual expansion. And this idea that if government reduces expenditure, it's going to create confidence in business and business will invest. And the empirical evidence that is based on has been shown. So it's, there's a paper by Alessina and Adania, and Alessina's work has been the basis for a lot of this notion of contracting expansion. And when these numbers were examined, including by the IMF, but many other academics, they showed problems in I classified expansion and contraction problems in all kinds of things, and empirically it's just wrong. And people across the spectrum, mainstream economists have shown that the cost of fiscal consolidation is just lower growth. And so the policy of austerity is a constraint on growth in itself. And we need to shift away from that and put money into people's hands and into the economy and industrial transformation in order to grow. And to then you grow yourself out of debt. And the issue isn't just the size of debt, but your debt to GDP levels. And you increase the size of GDP and the whole number comes down, the ratio declines. So that's my long answer. I'm just spending maybe a minute on some of the other stuff. But first to thank Rob very much for his support. It means a lot that he found the book useful and the chapters. It was it's very edifying to hear that. Thank you. Sorry, I was going to make just one more point. Now I've lost it. Actually, why don't we just hand over to Rob?
Great. Yeah, no, I think those are the useful points. I mean, I guess I should draw on that debate you're raising about austerity and the bank and IMF being obviously the proponent of that, but not when it comes to the United States, because the U.S. Federal Reserve, always has not only inflation but jobs, and as the indicator. And when the U.S. was lowering interest rates and increasing the value of currency around the world, so the issue came to the WTO because there was a so-called currency war. And I chaired the Committee on Trade, Debt and Finance. And when we asked the US, policymakers to come, both from the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, they said, we don't negotiate our sovereignty. That was the end of that debate. Over to you.
I'm tempted to start there because we pay a lot of attention to employment when we take interest rate decisions.
Yeah.
Just not employment in South Africa, it's employment in the United States. So the United States, when unemployment is low, then they tend to want to raise interest rates because they think that the inflationary pressures, the working class won't be in a position to demand a compensating thing. And so, when I sat in the finance committee, I would listen to the Reserve Bank and say, employment is this and this and this in the United States, therefore we think the interest rates, and we slavishly follow the interest rates. So we pay attention to employment, but not in South Africa. That's the problem. And our trends in employment is completely different, and we should be thinking about that rather than employment in the US. But let me just say that, how do we get out of austerity? That's the key question. I think that it's a question of Seeraj was saying that instead of the ratios coming first, what comes first is growth, inclusivity, reduction in these other ratios. And then we make a bet on that will improve the ratios over time because the growth will reduce the debt to GDP level. I think that if we were to do that and start to move in that direction, and I think Asghar is saying that, we would have to start to spend on some programs and start to spend on some programs that are particularly transformatory and also are addressing immediate needs of people. What we don't take account of is that if we expanded social grants, people would spend that. That would stimulate and probably spend it on domestically produced stuff rather than imports. And that would act as a stimulus as well. But we don't want to go there. And I think that if we were going to go there, that would mean that we would start to take on board, we would start to take on the financialized interest groups that have an alternative view. And if we were to go there, I think we'd have to go there carefully and really do more than we say rather than say more than we do. Step by step, we would have to start implementing a few of these things. I think that in the end of the day, why we have this ready reckoner of these ratios that are said to be applicable everywhere is that's been critiqued. And whether we need a budget deficit of less than 3%, inflation always in single digits. There's no real logic to that. But I don't think we'd take that on in the first instance. In the first instance, we start to spend on some programs and defend spending on those programs, and then see that the more inclusive growth comes in and industrial policy comes in. And I think that, I said it in my own book and on lots of other places, we said it. The problem we had with industrial policy during the Zuma administration was that Zuma didn't give a fig about it. He was happy to let us do it, but he didn't care about it. He didn't think it was prioritized. I don't know anywhere in the world where industrial policy of one department has worked. And that was what it was. It was one among several other things and not the most important. Where there were interventions, I think they showed they were better than nothing else, but it wasn't good enough. And then we also need to, we've gone this route of an infrastructure program with blended finance. So we've said, okay, government doesn't have the money, so let's go and find it in the private sector. That means the profits-seeking sector. That means we run around and de-risk. And we not only guarantee these guys against any default, but also we guarantee their high profit. And we wonder why not many of them are coming to the party, because that's been the experience of blended finance everywhere. So we had what we called a massive infrastructure program that was supposed to emerge after COVID. We haven't seen it. And actually, if you want to take some account of what that means, ArcelorMittal has closed 2 of its factories recently. Now, there's a lot of things they said, many of them are self-serving about, the other, the small smelters one. I think that's self-serving. They said one important thing. They're closing down the production of long products because they don't see an infrastructure program going, and there's no demand for their product. That's what happens when you follow this austerity. We don't need to get everything off the budget. Why are we not turning around to these people who hold 21 trillion rand of assets and saying that we expect that X% will be invested in infrastructure build or something like that? Why don't we turn around? That would be leadership. Instead of which we sort of run around and we try to persuade them. You know? We will work and we'll create this de-risking opportunity, and it doesn't really work. And I think those are the sort of things that we need to do, a combination of all of that. And I think it's in the end of the day, it comes down to that quote of Keynes. Too many of us, you know, you go back to the 1990s, you know, the book that was much read in government was called The Lexus on the Olive Tree by Thomas Friedman. I don't know if you all know this book. Thomas Friedman said, well, the Cold War's been won, there's no other show in town. You put on the golden straitjacket, you adopt all these policies, and then the electronic herds are going to come in and invest, and that's what you do. And we, you know, felt, no, there's no alternative, so we have gear, we'll do this and that. The gear program, I actually went to some meeting about a week before gear. I was told if I said anything, I was going to get put in jail. First time I ever went to, you know, any of these government meetings. And somebody there in the meeting called it a confidence trick. So there was no link between the macroeconomic ratios and the growth targets. The idea was that the investors were going to like the macroeconomic ratios, and they were going to pump in a huge amount of foreign direct investment that was going to create 6% growth and 400,000 jobs. Well, it didn't happen. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. And I think that's what we're learning again in another guy. So I think the real thing is that on all of these fronts, on the on the climate change issue, you know, if we avoid 2% rise in temperatures by the end of the century, you know, I think it's about as likely as you know, me being able to, you know, run 100 yards or something. So, but you know, it's not going to happen. But even if we do, we're going to have more and more extreme weather events. That we're more droughts, more floods, and everything. Now we should be having a massive program of climate proofing our infrastructure. Much of this is susceptible to public employment programs. Why is not I know in my own municipality up in the West Coast, they've done a study and looking at what sea levels are going to happen. Are they going to do anything about it? No. Well, it depends on the money. And you know, so we should be running a series of programs like that. That should be one of our priorities, and demanding funds and support for that. Well, there is going to be a loss and damage fund now, but I imagine the loss and damage is going to be for pretty direct damage rather than for proactive climate proofing. But that's what we need, we need that, and we need to be ensuring that we get industrial development off the green transition. If we don't, we're going to be, you know, this is what who was saying just now. Sam, that this scramble for Africa, running around. What are the new minerals that we can provide to somebody else's industry? How can we buy somebody else's products? And that's the future that lies for us if we don't do something different. And I think that's the real challenge that this book, among others, is putting on the table. We've really got to do things differently. Otherwise, the future will look like the past, and the past is too nasty to go into play.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let me thank Seeraj and your very able colleagues, your co-editors, Ambusweni, Goma, and Basan Beloy, for putting together a fabulous book, which I'm sure will become a textbook for debate. And I'm happy that, you know, there are other works that are in the genre that would stimulate new thinking about economic policy. And I mean, there are huge opportunities really that are unfolding to really support new thinking. One of those, of course, as we mentioned, is that the ideas are now all up for grabs because Washington is rethinking everything. So it gives us a lot of space both on macroeconomic policy, but also now on industrialization. Big debate in the United States, but the US is new and industrialized, not listening to the debate. It's just done what it needs to do. There's a 10-year program of investment in manufacturing, the biggest investment in manufacturing in the history of the United States by far. So we should be holding back. There's I think Hyun Lee told us about competitor countries. So there's a whole lot of countries out there that have moved significantly. And hey, look at what they've done. How did they do it? Again, Hyun Lee was a joint professor in our school, together with others who've been with us this year, like Hadrun Chang, have told us about ways in which more heterodox thinking can be emulated by those that have succeeded where we haven't. And then thirdly, I'd like to say that I think this transition, this whole big transition, whatever whichever way you like to think about it, the energy transition, the climate transition, the just transition, it is an opportunity to rethink everything, including, Michelle, what you say, the paradigm shift in how we think about consumption, about lifestyles, about production. It's all over, and as it should be. And it should be really about thinking about justice, social justice, and thinking about the poorest and the social sectors and the most oppressed and marginalized communities, and how to put them up front first in this transition. So a really big opportunity for all of us to rethink ideas. We know now the mainstream ideas are not just didn't quite work, but they may be also fundamentally incorrect. And so it is an opportunity to really debate these ideas, and this is a good place to do it in the school and generate debate amongst students and maybe generate a lot of new research projects in this space. So thank you so much, and to our able presenters and discussants. And to all of you on screen, thanks for participating, and so there's a glass of wine for those of you who drink, otherwise soft drinks. So join us.
Thank you.